Have you ever wondered how your life would look if you were born into another family?
At my mom's 40th anniversary dinner, she lifted her glass with that smile she always wore when she knew she had an audience. Tight, too bright, almost artificial, and she looked around the table like a seasoned actress right before delivering her big line. With her chin up and voice smooth, she said, "Some daughters just never grow up." But not her. And then, with that performative affection she'd perfected over the years, she gestured to my younger sister, Katie, who beamed like she'd just won a prize. Laughter erupted immediately, casual and warm, like it was just a cute little family joke. But I didn't laugh. I didn't even smile. I kept my fork hovering above my plate, eyes steady on my mother, and waited for the noise to die down, which it did gradually, awkwardly. When I pulled a manila folder out of my purse and laid it gently on the table between the candles and the untouched bread basket. You could almost feel the air shift when I did it. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Katie stopped chewing. Dad furrowed his brow like I'd just put a dead bird in front of him, and my mother's lips twitched slightly, just enough to reveal that she wasn't nearly as in control of the moment as she wanted everyone to believe. The thing about dinners like these, the special occasion kind where everything's prescripted, every seat is assigned, every dish carefully chosen to suit someone's image of domestic perfection, is that they rely on everyone playing along. You laugh at the jokes, you ignore the digs, and you smile, no matter what, because anything else would ruin the night. But I had already decided, days before this dinner, that I wasn't playing along anymore. "I figure tonight's as good a time as any," I said, voice calm but clear, as I flipped open the folder, revealing several neatly printed pages stapled together. My mother didn't move. Not even an eyebrow twitch. But her fork, midair, stayed frozen, just inches from her mouth, and I could see the knuckles on her right hand go white around the stem of her wineglass. Katie glanced between us, confused, but trying to keep her smile plastered in place, the way she always did when she didn't understand what was happening, but was smart enough to sense it was about to go south. "This," I continued, tapping the top page with one finger, "is a copy of the credit card bill I've been getting every month for the last year and a half. The one I didn't sign up for. The one that has your name on every transaction, but mine at the top, as the primary holder." My father blinked slowly, as though trying to process what I'd just said through some kind of mental fog, and Aunt Jean, sitting across from me, leaned in slightly, her eyes narrowing like someone finally getting confirmation on a long-held suspicion. For a moment, no one spoke, and it felt like the whole restaurant had gone quiet, even though I knew that wasn't true. It was just that, at our table, the show had stopped. My mother smiled then. It was a tight, brittle thing, barely different from her usual expression, but I knew her too well not to recognize the cracks forming beneath it. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she said lightly, like I'd just accused her of stealing cookies from a jar. But I didn't look away, didn't backpedal, didn't soften the accusation, because I wasn't just reacting in the moment. I'd planned this. I had spent weeks gathering documentation, printing statements, cross-referencing dates, and making sure that when I finally said something, I'd be able to stand behind every single word. "You signed up for a credit card using my social," I said, my voice steady, but my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. "You charged nearly $42,000 across retail stores, spas, hotel stays, and even Katie's baby shower decorations. You used my name, Mom. My credit. And you never said a damn word." Katie finally spoke then, voice high and uncertain, like she was trying to laugh, but didn't quite find it funny. "Wait, what are you talking about? That can't be right." I turned the page. "Spa weekend in Santa Fe, June 12th through 14th, room for two, full massage package, charged to my account. You posted photos, Katie. You were there. I wasn't." Silence. The kind of silence that tastes bitter, like metal, and makes your skin itch. The kind that falls not because people have nothing to say, but because they're too stunned or too scared to say it. My mother's smile didn't fade so much as it dissolved, piece by piece, like sugar cubes dropped in boiling water. "That's absurd," she said. "You must be mistaken. There must be some mix-up with the bank." I looked directly at her then, and I saw the life form in her eyes before it reached her mouth. Because here's the truth. When someone's been taking advantage of you for years, they get used to you staying quiet. They get comfortable. They don't expect you to ever fight back, especially not in front of people. And especially not like this. What's worse is that my mother wasn't doing this out of desperation. She wasn't struggling, she wasn't broke, and she certainly wasn't asking for help. No, this was entitlement. It was her assuming that everything I built for myself, my credit, my stability, my name, was hers to use because I owed it to her. Because in her mind, a daughter's success is just a trophy for the mother to wear. Dad cleared his throat. "Let's not turn this into a thing," he said, his voice soft, a little worn. "We're here to celebrate." "No," I said, cutting him off without even looking at him. "We're here because I finally decided I'm done pretending." Aunt Jean smirked, actually smirked, like she'd been waiting for this moment longer than I had. And Katie, God, poor Katie, was still staring at me like I'd just punched her in the stomach. I didn't care. I leaned back in my chair, folded the folder shut, and laid it neatly next to my water glass. Because I hadn't come here for closure. I came here for clarity. And I was just getting started. For a moment, after I shut the folder and placed it beside my plate, I honestly believed she might admit to it. Not out of guilt, of course, because guilt was never something my mother carried. What she carried instead was image, reputation, and that carefully curated sense of superiority she wore like a second skin. But I thought, just for a second, that backed into a corner, caught with her fingers not just in the cookie jar but halfway down the goddamn disposal, she might fess up. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, adjusted the napkin in her lap like we were still at the first toast, and let out a soft, performative laugh that sounded just rehearsed enough to make my blood pressure spike. "Oh, honey," she said, dragging out the word in that slow, syrupy voice she always used when trying to make me look like I was being dramatic in front of other people. "You've always been so imaginative. You used to do this as a kid, remember? Always thinking someone was out to get you." I could feel the heat creeping up my neck, not from embarrassment, but from the way she weaponized memories like that, cherry-picked moments from my childhood and twisted them until they supported whatever story she was trying to sell. In this case, that I was unhinged, overreacting, paranoid. A narrative she'd been pushing since I was old enough to question her version of events, and one the rest of the family had absorbed so well they barely realized it anymore. Katie looked at me, brow furrowed and confused, her mouth opening like she wanted to say something, but the words couldn't quite form. She wasn't used to seeing Mom challenged in public like this, and especially not by me. In our family dynamic, I had always been the one to back down, to swallow the bitterness, to let Mom rewrite the script while I played my assigned role as the difficult one, the problem child, the ungrateful daughter, the woman who just couldn't let things go. But tonight, I had brought receipts. And I was no longer interested in playing the part. I reached forward slowly, opened the folder again, and pulled out the second sheet, this one, a detailed breakdown of the purchases made on the card over the past 6 months. I slid it across the table toward Katie, not Mom, because I needed someone else to look at it. I needed someone to see what I'd seen night after night for the last 3 weeks as I pored over those pages, trying to make sense of how my credit score had suddenly dropped 80 points, how my name had ended up on a collection agency's list, and how, despite working 2 jobs, I was now thousands of dollars in debt for things I'd never bought. Katie looked down at the paper, and I watched her eyes scan the list. She blinked hard, frowned, then looked up at me confused. "These are places we went," she said, not to Mom, but to the room in general, as if trying to explain her own presence in the mess. "This is from the spa in Santa Fe. And the boutique in Dallas. Mom, you paid for those, right?" Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. Mom took a sip of wine, slow, deliberate, never breaking eye contact with me, and then set the glass down with a soft clink. "I told you," she said, voice measured, "I used my card. You must have misunderstood the statement." That was when I knew. She was still hoping to bluff her way out, hoping that if she just denied it long enough, loud enough, and with enough feigned offense, she could drown me out like she always had before. What she hadn't counted on was the fact that I'd finally stopped playing defense. I had documentation, screenshots, bank statements, customer service transcripts. I'd spent 2 weeks on hold with Chase and Capital One. I had copies of the applications she submitted online using my name, my address, and my social security number. I had everything. So I reached for the third sheet. "You filled out an online application on March 3rd, I said, loud enough now that the couple at the next table had stopped pretending not to listen. "You listed your phone number, but my email address, and you had the card shipped to your house. Then, you called and added yourself as an authorized user the next day." Mom's eyes narrowed, not because I was wrong, but because I wasn't letting her perform. Her stage had been taken away. "This is insane," Katie muttered, still staring at the printout. "Why would you do that, Mom?" "I wouldn't," she snapped, sharper than I'd expected, and the veneer cracked just a little. "I don't need her credit. I have my own." "But yours is maxed out," I said, cutting in before she could shift the narrative. "And the bank statements show payments being made from my checking account until I froze it. You're still wearing the bracelet you bought with my money. Shall I list more?" Dad looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. His hands were clasped together on the table, knuckles pale, and he stared straight ahead like he might disappear if he didn't make eye contact with anyone. I used to think he didn't know how bad it was, that he was simply unaware of how manipulative she could be, how toxic the entire dynamic had become. But I didn't believe that anymore. No one stays that oblivious for this long. He just didn't want to deal with it. "I've already reported the identity theft," I said, keeping my voice steady even though my hands were shaking under the table. "The credit bureaus are flagging my file, and the card's been shut down. Charges are under review, and if they find what I think they'll find, it's going to escalate." My mother said nothing. Katie opened her mouth again but couldn't seem to decide what to say. I saw the moment the reality started to hit her, not just that Mom had lied, but that the lie had been going on for months, maybe years. That the woman she praised constantly, the one she always defended, had used her own daughter's identity to bankroll her lifestyle, and had the gall to humiliate me at a dinner I paid for with my destroyed credit. And still, the worst part wasn't the debt. It wasn't the accounts or the phone calls or the stress of wondering if my life was going to unravel over someone else's choices. The worst part was that I wasn't surprised. Because deep down, I'd always known this moment would come. I just didn't think it would happen over champagne and ribeye while candles flickered over linen tablecloths. And as I watched my mother stare down at the documents, not apologizing, not explaining, just silently seething behind her wine glass, I realized something else. She wasn't ashamed. She was angry that I had pulled the curtain back. But I wasn't done yet. Not even close. It's a strange thing, really, how a person can survive years of subtle emotional sabotage and not fully understand the extent of the damage until someone else reacts with disbelief when you try to name it. That moment at the table, after I'd laid out months of evidence, exposed her fraud in front of the very family who had spent decades orbiting around her charm, and watched as she still tried to perform her innocence with all the grace of a beauty queen caught shoplifting, reminded me that this wasn't something new. This wasn't some isolated slip or a moment of financial desperation gone too far. This was a pattern, meticulously practiced and finely tuned, carried out over years, no, decades, and buried under the pretense of motherly concern, witty sarcasm, and well-timed tears. And for as long as I could remember, I'd been the only one who saw it for what it was. But now, in that restaurant thick with tension, as the weight of my accusations settled over the table like a fog, and my mother sat with her lips pressed into a line so tight I thought they might disappear, it became clear that the real damage hadn't been done to my credit, it had been done to my perception of reality. Because when you've spent your entire life being told you're the difficult one, the dramatic one, the one who remembers things wrong, you start to doubt your own instincts. You stop trusting your gut and instead rely on second-guessing every emotion, every reaction, every small suspicion. You learn to fact-check your memories against other people's reactions because the people closest to you have made it very clear, your version of events doesn't count unless they agree with it. I remember the first time it happened. I must have been 11 or 12, just old enough to understand injustice, but not yet old enough to do anything about it. I'd gotten into an argument with Katie over something small, maybe a sweater she'd taken from my room without asking, and I'd yelled at her. Not screamed, not cursed, just raised my voice out of frustration. I'd barely finished the sentence before Mom had stormed in, grabbed me by the arm, not hard enough to leave a bruise, just hard enough to make sure I shut up, and dragged me into the hallway where she told me, with that calm, low voice that always made my stomach twist, that girls who act like that end up alone. She said it not as a threat, but as a prophecy, like she was doing me a favor by letting me in on this secret truth of my future. And I'd believed her. Because what other choice did I have? The gaslighting didn't always come in loud accusations or overt denials. More often, it arrived dressed as jokes at my expense, teaching moments laced with judgment or subtle comparisons to Katie that left me feeling like no matter what I did, no matter how much I achieved or how hard I worked, it would never be quite enough. Katie, the golden child with the husband, the kids, the matching seasonal decor, and the social media perfect life, was everything Mom could brag about. And I was the cautionary tale. But what no one ever seemed to realize, or maybe just didn't want to admit, was that Katie's perfect life wasn't built in a vacuum. It was built, in large part, with support I was never given, with opportunities one watched her receive while I was told to be more grateful, less emotional, more obedient, less difficult. She got tuition money. I got lectures about independence. She got a car when she turned 16. I got told the bus was good for building character. So when Katie, still holding the statement in her now shaking hands, looked at me across the table and said, "I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know she was using your name," I believed her. Not because I trusted her completely, but because she had always been too wrapped up in her own orbit to question what made it so effortless to stay there. But what broke me more than her ignorance was Dad's silence. He hadn't said a word in over 10 minutes. He sat there with that vacant look on his face, staring somewhere past the centerpiece like maybe if he kept still long enough, this entire confrontation would simply dissolve into thin air and we'd go back to pretending everything was fine. And that was when Aunt Jean spoke. She'd been quiet the whole time, chewing her chicken slowly, sipping her wine without blinking, and watching the entire thing unfold like she'd been expecting it. She'd always been the oddball of the family, the one who wore too much eyeliner, drank boxed wine at holidays, and said things you weren't supposed to say out loud in polite company, but in that moment, she felt like the only sane one in the room. "I told y'all," she said, her voice raspy and steady, eyes locked on my mother. "I told you 15 years ago when she tried to open a store account in my name and got caught. Y'all acted like I was drunk or making it up. But I knew. I've always known." The silence that followed wasn't just awkward, it was suffocating. Mom didn't respond. She didn't defend herself. She just sat there, slowly turning the stem of her glass between her fingers like she was waiting for the earth to swallow her whole. But it didn't. And neither did I. Because I had finally learned that you don't need your family's permission to tell the truth. You don't need their approval to draw the line. And you sure as hell don't need their blessing to finally stop pretending that love, just because it's biologically obligated, should come at the expense of your sanity. I turned to Aunt Jean and said, "Thank you," not because it changed anything, but because it meant I wasn't entirely alone in this warped little theater we called a family. And then I stood. Because if there was one thing I'd learned through this whole ordeal, it was that sometimes the most powerful move isn't yelling or crying or demanding justice. It's standing up, calmly, clearly, with every fact on your side, and saying, "I'm not going to let you pretend anymore." And as I looked down at my mother, still clinging to the last shreds of her performance, I realized something else. She wasn't sorry. She was scared. Not of the police. Not of the fallout. But of the fact that I had finally learned how to beat her at her own game. And that was only the beginning. There's a certain kind of revenge that doesn't require fire, doesn't need raised voices or shattered glass or dramatic exits, because it doesn't play by the usual rules of confrontation, doesn't beg for recognition or demand a round of applause. It just unfolds slowly, precisely, like a carefully designed trap snapping shut, not with a bang but with a whisper, leaving the target not bleeding, but exposed, vulnerable and cornered, and that's the kind of revenge I had prepared for my mother. Not because I wanted to destroy her life, not because I wanted to see her grovel at my feet, but because I needed her to finally feel what I had lived with for years, powerlessness wrapped in the illusion of control. The slow suffocation of losing everything while everyone around you carries on as if nothing's wrong. After that dinner, after the wine had stopped flowing and the laughter had curdled into silence and Katie had all but fled the table with her phone in hand and her mouth clamped shut, I had returned home not triumphant, not elated, but strangely calm. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I didn't even vent to the two friends who had known about the situation for months and had offered me nothing but support and disbelief in equal measure. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table, opened my laptop, and reread the email thread with the attorney I'd hired 2 weeks earlier. His name was Michael, and he wasn't flashy or aggressive. He didn't promise retribution or assure me of a courtroom victory. What he promised me was protection, legal, documented, meticulous protection from further damage, from retaliation, from the quiet erosion of my financial identity that had already cost me more than just a decent credit score. You see, I didn't just close the card. I didn't just call the fraud hotline and spend hours on hold and cry into the receiver as I explained, over and over, that I didn't make those purchases, that I had no idea there was a balance of $42,000 in my name. No. I filed a police report. I submitted affidavits. I locked down my credit across all 3 bureaus and installed fraud alerts that would make even the boldest scammer think twice. I wasn't going to wait for another account to show up, for another collection agency to call me at 8 in the morning demanding payment for my mother's lavish dinners and boutique clothing hauls. And here's where it gets worse or better, depending on your perspective. I didn't just stop at fixing the damage. I began to build a case. Because for years, my mother had counted on one thing, that I would stay silent out of shame. That I would hide the evidence because admitting your own mother betrayed you like that is, in many ways, more humiliating than the betrayal itself. She had bet everything on the assumption that I would care more about keeping up appearances than I would about protecting myself. But this time, she'd bet wrong. I had printed statements, bank transfers, even screenshots of text messages she had sent me months ago, messages that, at the time, I'd brushed off as typical mom manipulation, but that now read like breadcrumbs leading straight to the truth. I took care of that bill, no need to worry, she had written in April. I've got a handle on it. You should focus on your work. Vague enough to seem harmless, but specific enough, when paired with the corresponding charges and timestamps, to prove intent. When I told Michael everything, every detail, every incident, every bizarre justification she'd offered in the past when caught in smaller lies, he didn't flinch. He just nodded and said, "This is more common than people think. And the ones who do it, they usually don't stop until someone stops them." So that's what I became. The one who stopped her. I filed a formal complaint with the state's Attorney General's office. I requested a cease and desist letter. I even contacted a credit repair service, not the shady kind that promises miracles, but the kind that works with attorneys to clear documented identity theft. Every move I made was quiet, deliberate, traceable. No drama. No shouting matches. Just a slow, methodical reclaiming of my life. What I didn't expect, what I honestly hadn't predicted, was that she would try to keep going. 3 days after the dinner, I got an email from Capital One saying there had been an attempted application in my name, flagged because of the recent alerts on my file. The address matched hers. The phone number, again, was hers. She hadn't even bothered to use a burner number or try a new address. It was as if she believed she was untouchable. As if all the evidence I'd dropped on the table was just a bluff, a momentary outburst she could outlast, the way she had outlasted every other confrontation in our family's history. But this time, there were consequences. I called Michael. He advised me to take the attempted fraud report to the police and update the case file. I did. The officer taking the report didn't say much, but I could tell from the way his eyebrows lifted slightly when I said, "my mother," that this wasn't the first time he'd heard a story like mine. You'd be surprised how often this happens, he said, his voice low, as he handed me a copy of the updated report. It's the people closest to you. They know what you'll let them get away with. But that's the thing, she didn't know me anymore. Maybe she never really did. The final piece came when I sent her a letter through my attorney, a formal notification that she was to cease all use of my name, credit, or identifying information, effective immediately. It included language about civil liability, restitution, and the potential for criminal charges. It was cold, professional, impersonal. The kind of letter you send to a stranger who's been harassing you, not the woman who gave birth to you. And that's exactly how it had to be. Because she had chosen to become someone I could no longer treat like family. And I had chosen to become someone who would no longer be manipulated into silence. I never got a response to that letter. Not directly. But 2 days later, I received a text from an unknown number. No name, no greeting, just a single line. You'll regret this. I didn't reply. I just blocked the number, sat down at my desk, and logged into my bank account, where, for the first time in over a year, there were no unfamiliar charges, no drained balances, no mysterious transactions labeled with dates and times that didn't belong to me. And that, I realized, was the victory. Not in seeing her punished, not in watching her squirm, but in knowing that she had finally, definitively, lost access to the thing she had taken for granted the most. Me. And I wasn't done yet. The final act didn't come with a dramatic door slam or a family-wide confession drenched in tears and apologies, because real endings, especially in families like mine, rarely arrive in such clean, satisfying packages. What came instead was a quiet, calculated shift, a rearranging of power, of voice, of presence, and once it started, it spread like a crack in glass, subtle at first, then widening until nothing that had stood before could be trusted to remain the same. In the week that followed the dinner, I didn't hear from my mother, not directly, and certainly not through anything that sounded like remorse or reflection, but the silence wasn't empty. It was loaded, weighted with the heaviness of someone who was no longer in control, someone who had, perhaps for the first time in her life, been caught in a lie that couldn't be smoothed over with charm or excuses or strategically dispensed tears. Katie, ever the buffer between us, called me once, just once, and her voice, usually chirpy and fluid with small talk, sounded tired, like she'd aged 10 years in the span of 7 days. She didn't apologize for taking Mom's side, and I hadn't expected her to. That kind of awakening, when it finally comes, doesn't arrive with humility or open arms. It arrives with resistance, denial, then shame, and if it ever turns into change. It takes time, sometimes years. What she did say was simple, barely a whisper. She's been quiet. Really quiet. I don't think she knows what to do. I didn't say what I was thinking. That silence was, for once, appropriate. What I didn't tell Katie, not then and maybe never, was that I hadn't confronted our mother just to punish her. That might have been part of it, sure, but what I truly wanted, what I'd always wanted, was something much smaller, and yet impossibly large at the same time: recognition. I wanted someone to finally look at me, really look at me, and see the years I'd spent holding up this family's emotional scaffolding without thanks, the sacrifices I'd made that no one noticed, the financial stability I'd built from scratch after being told I was irresponsible, only to have it gutted behind my back by the very person who claimed to love me most. I wanted someone to say, that wasn't fair. But if life had taught me anything, it was that fairness rarely enters through the front door. It sneaks in through the cracks, long after you've stopped looking for it. So when the letter arrived, a thick envelope with no return address, my name written in my mother's neat, unmistakable script, I already knew what it would be. I sat with it for nearly an hour before opening it, half hoping it would be different this time, that she would surprise me, that there would be something inside that resembled accountability. But when I finally slid the pages out, unfolded them, and began to read, I felt a strange calm settle over me, not the peace of forgiveness, not the relief of reconciliation, but the cold clarity of confirmation. The letter, filled with long, winding paragraphs and phrases carefully crafted to sound like concern, was not an apology. It was, instead, a desperate attempt at reframing. She didn't admit guilt. She didn't even reference the fraudulent accounts directly. What she did do, in her usual style, was paint herself as misunderstood, maligned, and heartbroken. She wrote of family confusion, of miscommunications that spiraled out of control, of how hurt people, and how she hoped that, one day, I would understand the pressure she had been under, the stress, the loneliness. The sense of invisibility she claimed had driven her to make unwise decisions. Not criminal decisions. Not betrayal. Unwise decisions. And that's when I understood, with bone-deep certainty, that my mother had never seen me as a person with boundaries, with autonomy, with a life that existed outside of her influence. I was, and had always been, a resource, financial, emotional, and moral, something to draw from when needed, a source of supply she expected to remain loyal, silent, and forgiving, no matter the cost. And now that I had removed myself from that role, she wasn't seeking forgiveness, she was seeking reinstatement. I folded the letter carefully, deliberately, like one might handle a relic of a life that no longer exists, walked to the sink, and set it down. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I simply stood there, staring at the paper that had once held so much power over me, and realized it no longer did. And in that moment, without fanfare, I struck the final match, not out of revenge, not out of spite, but because some bridges need to be burned for the light they give off when they go. The letter curled at the edges, then darkened, then vanished into flame, and I watched it turn to ash without a single pang of guilt. Because in the end, it wasn't about making her pay. It was about making me free. Still, not everything found closure. A week later, Katie called again. This time, her voice was more brittle, like something had cracked beneath the surface. "You need to know something," she said, her words halting. "She's talking to a lawyer. I think she might try to claim emotional distress. She says you slandered her." I laughed then, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. After everything she had done, after the financial theft, the public humiliation, the calculated emotional harm, she still believed she was the one who had been wronged. It was so perfectly in character it almost felt scripted. "I documented everything," I said simply. "She can try. Let her." But something in Katie's silence unnerved me, not fear, exactly, but a kind of exhausted complicity, like she had finally seen our mother clearly and didn't know how to live with the image. I didn't press her. I had stopped trying to rescue people who didn't want to be rescued. That was another lesson I had learned too late. The truth is, the aftermath didn't come with a final confrontation or some cinematic resolution. My mother didn't end up in handcuffs. She didn't collapse in remorse. She didn't write a final, heartfelt apology. What she did was retreat slowly, subtly, shifting from direct manipulation to passive silence, from control to distance. And while some part of me will always wish things had ended differently, that she could have owned her actions and made amends, I've come to understand that not all wounds close with apologies. Some just stop bleeding when you stop going back to the person who cut you. I still see her sometimes, in passing, in photos Katie texts me, in the background of holiday events I no longer attend. And every time, I am reminded not of what she took from me, but of what I took back. My name, my voice, my peace. Because sometimes, revenge isn't loud or final or perfectly tied up in bows. Sometimes it's as simple as leaving your plate half finished, standing up from the table and walking away without explaining yourself. And when they call after you, asking where you're going, what you're doing, or why you're not playing along anymore, you don't answer. You just keep walking. Quiet. Clear. Unafraid. Because they already know. Even if they'll never admit it.